Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency. It's my privilege to welcome you to the launch of the 2021 Prosperity Index. Unbelievably, this is our 15th global edition. And my name is Alan McCormick. I am the chairman of the Legatum Institute. This evening, tonight is one of my favorite events in our annual calendar. And as we had hiatus last year, it's so refreshing to see us all here in person. I think if you're living in London, you don't realize it, but you're actually living in a little bubble of freedom at the moment. And it's so refreshing to be here maskless and with so many friends. So thank you for coming out on this wet November evening. For the first time, this year's launch is fully hybrid. Alongside our many guests here in London, we've got hundreds of people joining us online, giving me the privilege of welcoming our biggest ever global audience to this launch. So welcome to those online. And for those of you who are not familiar with the work of the Legatum Institute, we're a public policy think tank, and we've set ourselves an ambitious mission, which is to create a global movement of people committed to creating the pathways from poverty to prosperity and the transformation of society. And in practice, what this means is that we champion open economies, empowered and responsible people, and inclusive and peaceful societies. Time and again, these core raw ingredients prove themselves to be indispensable to development and human flourishing. And the Prosperity Index, which we're launching tonight, is a practical tool for delivering real life change, change for people and nations at any stage of development. It reveals the way to a higher standard of living and the growth of nations. And the Institute's amazing and hardworking metrics team uses more than 50,000 data points to assess prosperity in 167 countries. And that covers 99% of the global population. And so what we really try and do is get under the bonnet of these countries and understand what's really going on. And we see repeatedly that private initiative enabled by a supportive state is core to unleashing both wealth and well-being. And Legatum's index is unique. It looks beyond economic measures like GDP and beyond the simplistic solutions of spending ever more money. It captures something fundamentally more important. What it is that really makes life more meaningful, more abundant, and simply more worth living. That concept has been brought into stark relief by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has shown us the very best of humanity, not just doctors and nurses performing daily heroics, but people looking after their neighbors and the most vulnerable in their communities. But the pandemic has also accentuated fault lines. As governments around the world sought to handle this disease, liberties have been curtailed and a new, more coercive way of life imposed. And in terms of the data, last year's pandemic has shaved 3.6% off global GDP, locking people in their homes for extended periods of time, shutting down economies, businesses and schools, and disrupting supply chains, it turns out will have ramifications which are going to be felt for years to come. We'll hear tonight, though, that even before the pandemic, there had already been a marked reduction globally in key freedoms and the quality of global governance. Culturally, the advent of identity politics has superseded facts, debate, and the competition of ideas. We've seen the pernicious rise of a particular form of political coercion with more public denunciations and a council culture. And this is an important point for us to address, and Philippa will unpack it more later. The index reveals that we should not take lightly the gains that have been hard-earned, an inheritance that we sitting here have all received. We must not take our prosperity for granted. Now is the time for serious reflection on where our current values will take us. And all of this will be picked up by our contributors over the next hour as we explore the impact of the pandemic on global prosperity, as well as other trends that are covered in this year's index. In particular, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to His Excellent President Masisi of Botswana. Welcome. He is our keynote speaker tonight, and he'll be speaking about Botswana's rich history as a beacon of African prosperity, and it's as a standout nation in Africa as well for its high standards of integrity and the enlightened way in which it's managed its politics, economy over the last 50 years. And our distinguished lineup of speakers also includes John Anderson, who's getting up at some unearthly hour of the morning to join us, who's the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, as well as Neil Oliver, who is a historian, author, broadcaster, and a keen observer. And for watchers of GB News, some might say modern day prophet as well. And he will close our proceedings with a few observations. So once again, to all of you, thank you for joining us this evening. We're delighted to have you here. I'm now going to hand over and welcome Philippa Stroud, the CEO of the Legatum Institute, to the stage. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for your kind introduction, and for all that you do for us as chairman of the Legatum Institute. We're hugely grateful. And we're also hugely grateful to the Legatum Group for all of your generosity and support for the Institute, particularly over the last couple of years as we've gone through this global pandemic. We are really grateful. We are delighted to have so many of you joining us here tonight and also joining us online. And we have been massively looking forward to this evening. Everyone in this room has one single vision: to deliver a more prosperous world. A world where all people are free to fulfill their unique potential. And the Legatum Institute is committed to understanding what builds prosperity for individuals, for communities, and for nations right around the world. And while much of our research inevitably focuses on developing nations, the challenge of cultivating and nurturing prosperity is common to each and every one of us. Prosperous nations at the top of the index can falter, and poorer nations at the bottom of the index can still thrive. And the Legatum Prosperity Index provides a unique framework to help leaders identify their specific challenges and to shape their agenda for transformation. And it provides a crucial measure of accountability, allowing others to hold leaders to account for their actions. And as we've heard, the index's framework is comprehensive, measuring prosperity across 3 domains, 12 pillars, 67 elements, and 300 indicators. That's an awful lot. But to see what that actually means for people like you and me, and for people around the world, we've broken that down, and here's a short video that explains the concept of prosperity.
Prosperity is much more than mere wealth or economic growth. True prosperity is when all people have the opportunity to thrive. In a prosperous society, people live in peace, free from the threat of violence, oppression, and crime. Everyone's inherent dignity is respected, and all are free to vote, to protest, and to follow their beliefs. Governing institutions in every sector act with truth and integrity and are subject to the rule of law. And there are stable families and supportive communities that instill the values that shape the culture and build the bonds of trust needed for society to flourish. Prosperity is driven by an open economy that harnesses ideas and talent to foster employment and productivity and create sustainable pathways out of poverty. In a prosperous nation, open markets and high-quality infrastructure facilitate trade and commerce. There is a strong investment environment and effective business regulation that enables entrepreneurship, competition, and innovation. And people have the opportunity to work, to earn, to save, to take risks, and to succeed. Prosperity is built by empowered people who choose to live in right relationship with one another and create a society in which everybody is able to build a life free from poverty. People take care of their physical and mental well-being and can rely on a healthcare system that will take care of them when they need it. Learning is valued and everyone receives a high-quality education so they can write their own futures. And the natural environment is stewarded wisely as a legacy for present and future generations. Prosperity means everyone has the opportunity and freedom to fulfill their unique potential and take responsibility for contributing to their communities and nations. Because ultimately, prosperity is not just what we have on the outside. It is also about who we become on the inside. True prosperity is a life well lived.
But if prosperity is about a life well lived, the past 2 years have been a period of extraordinary challenge for many of us. The pandemic has had a profound impact on our lives and livelihoods, and it has shown just how interconnected and interdependent our world really is. And though we all hope that the worst is now over, COVID-19 will continue to cast a long shadow over our society and economies for some time to come. Given this backdrop to this year's index, it highlights unsurprisingly that global prosperity has stagnated for the second year in a row. But whilst the pandemic has undoubtedly contributed to this trend of stagnation, it is not actually the sole cause. The breadth of the index allows us to highlight some of the longer-term trends undermining prosperity, some of which have been further exacerbated by our response to the pandemic. The trends highlighted by this year's index pose a number of profound questions for us all. Questions about the nature of our relationship with government. Questions about how we manage the many trade-offs in a crisis. And questions about how we nurture and protect the very foundations of prosperity. To begin to answer some of these questions and to introduce us to the key findings from this year's index, we have prepared this short video.
Between 2015 and 2019, global prosperity improved steadily. But this year's Legatum Prosperity Index highlights that prosperity has stagnated for the second year running due to the short-term impacts of COVID-19 and the long-term erosion of many of the core foundations of prosperous societies. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a major increase in global mortality, with over 5 million deaths reported from the beginning of the pandemic until the end of 2021. This equates to a level of excess mortality not witnessed in Western Europe since World War II. The global economy contracted twice as much as it did during the financial crisis in 2008, with GDP per capita decreasing in 147 countries. Government responses to the pandemic have also caused economic quality to deteriorate in all regions of the world, with the sharpest decline in North America. Unemployment increased in 158 nations, while government debt increased in 149. The pandemic has impacted the world at a time when many of the core foundations of prosperous societies were already under increasing strain. Key facets of governance have deteriorated for the third successive year. Executive constraints have declined or stagnated in 116 countries, with Jordan and China experiencing the sharpest declines. And political accountability has weakened in 64 countries. Over the last decade, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly have weakened across all regions of the world, including in 80% of nations where political accountability had also deteriorated. This decline has been most pronounced in Asia-Pacific, MENA and Eastern Europe, and notably with deteriorations in Hong Kong. This year's index also highlights that the world's two most prosperous regions, North America and Western Europe, have been the main contributors to the stalling of global prosperity. However, the bright light in a world of stagnating prosperity has been Sub-Saharan Africa's modest but consistent progress over the past decade, with 40 out of the continent's 49 countries improving. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact on lives and livelihoods right across the world. But it has also shone a crucial spotlight on the responsibility of leaders to be accountable to their citizens and to uphold their fundamental liberties.
So as you have seen, this year's Prosperity Index has given us plenty to discuss, plenty to debate, and plenty to inform our decision-making. But to help us understand the pathway that the nations go on as they're building their prosperity, I would like to invite on stage the Institute's Director of Policy, a very long-term colleague of mine and a great friend of mine, Dr. Stephen Bryan. Stephen.
Thank you, Philippa. So, how do you create national prosperity? And this has been the question that we have been researching and really considering for quite some time. As Alan mentioned, 15 years on the index. And through that, we've looked at the history of nations and how they've developed over decades, and not least Botswana is one of our prime examples. Three patterns have emerged. And the first is that successful nations that go on that pathway build inclusive societies. You've heard Alan mention it. And this is about starting at the basis of creating a sense of national cohesion that allows for that safety and security that we heard about in the first video. And this really is a starting point to allow people to engage with each other with shared values and vision. And this is, by the way, no mean feat. I mean, as we have worked and talked with people in countries such as Ethiopia or the Central African Republic, these are real life challenges today. The really important thing about this safety and this security is that it comes from the bottom up rather than through coercion. Because if people aren't free, if they're not able to pursue their own lives without undue restrictions or discrimination, they can't fulfill themselves or their colleagues. And this requires real protection of those freedoms we just heard about, freedom of speech, worship, and assembly, because that's what's going to allow people to take advantage of the opportunities for economic and social well-being. Because so many of these opportunities involve people being able to dream, to imagine, to experiment. And that requires a sense of freedom, because if you don't have that integral sense of freedom, you're not going to try things out because of the fear factor. So that's one reason why we have pointed out these issues of freedom are so important to prosperity. But now, of course, society is complex, and there needs to be some form of coordination. We can't just have anarchy. And this is where good governance comes in. The starting point here is around the sense of having political capacity that allows decisions to be made, but then they are respected and accepted. And the underpinnings of that is to have real political accountability and a government whose actions they subject themselves to the rule of law, because then you've got that popular acceptability. And also, underpinning that needs to be a government whose actions are focused on the needs of the citizens and doing so with integrity and without corruption, because then you start to have a real sense of a social contract. And in addition to that, social capital, that sense of those nurturing bonds, strong families supporting each other, neighbors and friends engaging, but most particularly, and this comes from having that cohesion in the first place, trust between strangers, because we're so much more than our direct connections. We need that trust. And all the evidence is that societies that have stronger bonds of trust between strangers have greater social and greater economic well-being. So that's encapsulating theme number one, how to create an inclusive society. Now, in parallel, an open economy is needed to create the wealth and the resources that we all need. And that's not about simply around enabling international trade. In fact, that sense of openness is most important when you think domestically. The opportunity for everybody to be able to engage in commerce, not just the privileged insiders. So the property rights are as secure for a rural smallholder as they are for the international conglomerate working in a business park. Or so that the regulations, the business regulations that we heard about, are as supportive of an informal urban worker as they may be for somebody working in a large corporation using public procurement or whatever. It's a really critical sense that the entire economy is working together, that everybody's able to participate. And when we contrast that with places with closed political systems, whether it's from Algeria to Zimbabwe, what you see is in those political systems, the economic structures are designed, in effect, to maintain power and to reward the elites. But what we need is the democratization. The open economy is about democratizing the economy so everybody participates. And that idea of earned success is available to all. So that leads me on to the third theme, empowered people, where the goods and services, the resources, the wealth in the economy are deployed in a way that allows everybody to be able to earn a good living, to be able to take care of their health and access healthcare, so that society is investing in its future through education. In a way, a critical point, a critical juncture point for so many countries on their development path is to be able to say, we don't need aid to help us with all these things. We are now working as a society, we're generating our own resources, we're investing in our people, and we're truly empowered because actually it's coming from within. And you see that in a real contrast, say, for example, between the way the country at the top of the index, Norway, has a sovereign wealth fund where it's not extracting oil and using it for self-serving purposes, it's investing in its future. In contrast, for example, say Venezuela or Russia, not doing that. It's not creating an empowered society. And the real telltale sign of whether this is working actually is when you look at the natural environment. Because societies that are inclusive societies, where the economy is open and engaged and people are empowered, these are the societies that are stewarding the natural environment because they can and they want to. And this is really important when we start to think about prosperity through the generations. And that in a nutshell is the virtuous cycle that we propose that nations are able to go on, creating an inclusive society that allows an open economy to flourish and where the resources are invested in empowering people. Now, this, to conclude, is by no means an easy matter. And I think it's well worth recognizing that this requires a long journey, vision, and determination. And I think just to pick up on that theme on vision and determination, I'd like you to welcome Philippa back to introduce our next topic.
Thank you, Stephen. That was particularly cheeky. By any assessment, one of the nations that exemplifies a genuine development success story is Botswana. It has been transformed from one of the world's poorest nations at independence in 1966 to a nation which now ranks 82nd in the Prosperity Index. As such, Botswana has made inspirational progress on the pathway from poverty to prosperity, rightly becoming a model of good governance and sound economic management. At the heart of this success story has been a succession of national leaders who have led their country with integrity, vision, and determination. Botswana has done the difficult things well. Their record sets them apart from many of their peers. They have prioritized governance. They have safeguarded personal freedom. They have upheld their safety and security and invested in their economic quality. And none of this is easy, but Botswana has done it by applying a long-term focus and taking the tough decisions. There can be little doubt of this nation's determination to flourish. But in order to share with us Botswana's inspirational story of national transformation, I'm hugely honoured to welcome to the stage His Excellency, President Masisi of Botswana. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Baroness Philippa Stroud, Director of Ceremonies and the Chief Executive Officer of the Legatum Institute, the Honorable Minister, Dr. Lemogang Kwape, the Minister of International Affairs and Cooperation of the Republic of Botswana, my dear First Lady, my beloved wife, Neo Jane Masisi, and I don't often get to stand before an audience as distinguished as this and wish her a happy 50th birthday. Mr. Alan McCormick, the Chairman of the Board of Trustees at the Legatum Institute, Mrs. Tsitsi Masiwa, Board of Trustees of the Legatum Institute, Mrs. Neil Oliver and John Anderson, both of whom I look forward to hearing more from later on. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. It is with profound gratitude that I stand before you today as we launch the 15th Legatum Prosperity Index 2021. The honor bestowed on me as a keynote speaker is testament to the confidence and high regard that the Legatum Institute has in the Republic of Botswana. The Legatum Institute is a well-known think tank whose prosperity index is used by many governments across the world to set their agendas for growth and development. Therefore, my acceptance of the kind invitation from the prestigious institute is an indication of the seriousness with which my country takes the work of this institute. It is indeed an honor for me to share with you Botswana's political and economic journey since independence in the year of our Lord, 1966. In that year, Botswana was among the poorest countries in the world. Truly poor. As Philippa said, heavily dependent on foreign aid for both recurrent and development budgets, and received food rations from friends and development partners to feed her population. However, the whole scenario took a turn for the better when Botswana discovered minerals, particularly diamonds, in the 1970s. The discovery of minerals changed the history of Botswana, and the country became a development success story. Many have asked why and how, because it has become common that many African countries endowed with abundant natural resources and mineral wealth are involved in what appears to be inescapable civil strife. Botswana's success story is due to the prudent management of resources that our founding fathers have practiced since independence. Furthermore, our culture of good governance, constitutional democracy, and commitment to the rule of law has played a major role in Botswana's success story. This culture is built on the traditions of the Kgotla system, which is an indigenous form of democratic governance that predates the independence era. It promotes the consultative and democratic processes that government and Botswana continue to practice to this day. And just last week, I was in a series of Kgotla meetings. It is therefore our culture, combined with good governance and prudent management of resources, that has led to the political stability and national unity that Botswana continue to enjoy and cherish. In addition, Botswana adopted policies and legislation that promote equal benefit from natural resources by all citizens. Today, government remains the custodian of natural resources to ensure equal benefit by all citizens. Due to participatory approach to development, our people and local communities are consulted on national issues and involved in decision-making processes. In a nutshell, our citizens are at the epicenter of our development trajectory. Furthermore, Botswana has a vibrant and independent judiciary, along with oversight institutions, which play a significant role in enforcing ethical practice and accountability. These institutions are supported by the Parliamentary Accounts Committee, which monitors the use of government funds, and it is always chaired by a member of an opposition party by law. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the government of Botswana is determined to fight corruption in all its manifestations without fear or favor. We are therefore reviewing the Corruption and Economic Crime Act to align it to other statutes. This review will also help to strengthen measures for accountability. As a result of our unwavering commitment to strengthen anti-money laundering activities in the country, Botswana was removed from the International Monetary Watchdog, the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, grey list following her compliance with the task force standards recently. And we will continue to work in collaboration with our development partners and the international community to keep our guard high and ensure that we improve and never, ever revert to grey listing status. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, revenue from the extraction of mineral resources deposits have been invested in the development of strategic social and physical infrastructure, such as roads, electricity, schools, hospitals, airports, and information communication technologies. Responsible mining and prudent management of our resources have immensely contributed to Botswana's rapid economic growth. As I speak to you today, we are able to provide relatively free and affordable education and health, among others, to all our citizens. From a country that relied on food aid and depended on foreign aid at independence, today we are able to provide free meals at schools across the country. We have also rolled out a number of social welfare programs for destitutes, people with disabilities, remote area dwellers, orphans and the elderly, amongst others, reaching further of the furthest and trying our very best to ensure that no one is left behind. Since the 1980s, Botswana has been able to finance a national budget, especially from the dividend revenues. Ladies and gentlemen, Botswana's Vision 2036 espouses a knowledge-based economy that will catapult the country to a high income status by 2036. In May this year, I announced a reset agenda. This is a catalytic and complementary initiative that will accelerate Botswana's transformation agenda. The reset agenda has literally reset national priorities for the nation, for government and its people, and it is people-centric. At the core of this reset agenda is to, one, save Botswana's population from COVID-19 by rolling out a successful vaccination program that will cover all Botswana and residents in the country. And if you look at the data, we're well on our way. Two, to align Botswana government's machinery to the government agenda, to ensure that the national transformation agenda will be embodied in the public service of the day. Three, digitization aims to achieve a digital economy in the shortest possible time, taking advantage of the technologies offered by the fourth industrial revolution. And four, value chain development aims to unlock opportunities for new high growth companies in the private sector, focusing on minerals, tourism, agriculture, and education, among others. And five, last but not least, mindset change, which encourages creativity, efficiency, effectiveness, and agility. The reset agenda, along with other implementation mechanisms that aim to transform Botswana, cannot be possible without the support of our development partners, without the support of the private sector and civil society. And here I want to thank you, Mr. Strive Masiyiwa. I don't know if you're in the audience. All right, he's with us online, I bet. Thanks, Strive Masiyiwa, for all that he did to ensure that we got some of the vaccines for COVID-19. As a country, we adhere to an open market economy that promotes the participation of potential business people within and outside the country. I therefore invite investors from your great country to make deliberate decisions and invest in prosperous Botswana. To the Legatum Institute, I challenge you, as I thank you for tonight, to institutionalize your brand, your broad and thorough methodology by partnering with key institutions in Botswana to grow and spread the capacity to so well measure and report prosperity. If we are to realize sustainable development and improved human well-being, we must, as a matter of course, know if we have improved and how we have improved. The tools and the accompanying skills need to be made a ubiquity in our part of the world, and for that too to be measured as an attribute of prosperity. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I want to emphasize that as an open and transparent country, Botswana remains committed to strengthening institutions that play an oversight role, including the free press and an independent judiciary, as well as sustaining an apolitical public service. You have been such a gracious audience by granting me such polite circumstance to make my point. I thank you for your generosity and very good evening.
Your Excellency, we are so grateful to you for your inspiring speech tonight. And Stephen and I have just had a private meeting and we accept your challenge to institutionalize the index into the institutions of Botswana. Botswana's journey is not just a source of inspiration. It is also an example to us all. An example of what can be achieved by visionary and selfless leadership, and by grit and determination. But as Botswana's example demonstrates, the process of national transformation is far from inevitable and requires leaders with intentionality. This year's index highlights that prosperity cannot be taken for granted, even for the most successful of nations. Leaders in every nation are confronted by the threat of deteriorating prosperity and of managing trade-offs through this time of crisis. Trade-offs that deliver inclusive societies, open economies, and empowered people. In many nations, we are seeing the very foundations of this prosperity challenged and the dividends of prosperity jeopardized. Our next video examines some of the threats to these foundations and why we should be wary of complacency.
The pathway to prosperity is not inevitable. Building prosperity takes time, but can be undermined in a blink of an eye. When governments face difficult times, there's always a temptation to adopt easy short-term political solutions. But building and protecting prosperity calls for tough choices, long-term grit and determination. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the world has gone through a process of transformation, ushering in a new era of freedom and opportunity. There's been rapid prosperity improvements in nations that have undergone enormous transitions. Since 1989, across the world, the number of democracies has almost doubled to 99 today. 91 countries have experienced a reduction in their levels of corruption, boosting personal freedoms and unleashing economic potential. And these transformations have delivered unprecedented political accountability across Eastern Europe and beyond, with nearly half of former Soviet nations experiencing an improvement in their civil liberties. Closed economies have opened up. Nearly 100 countries have strengthened their property rights, and even more have improved their domestic business freedoms. And a similar number have seen international trade grow as a share of GDP, with the reduction of tariffs across the globe. This economic progress has led to real and tangible results for people around the world. Global average life expectancy has increased to over 70 years. Around 1 billion more children are attending school. Fewer children are dying in infancy, and there's been a 65% reduction in the proportion of people living in extreme poverty since 1989, equating to some 1.2 billion people. However, this remarkable progress has also created a sense that the building of prosperity is inevitable. The international community has now focused its attention on the outcomes that prosperity delivers, on the improvements in education, health, poverty reduction, and living conditions. These are, of course, important, but they are the fruits of building well, and we run the risk of losing sight of the foundation stones that made countries prosperous in the first place. And without a renewed focus on these foundations, these outcomes will falter. Today, the world faces such a moment of decision, with global prosperity stagnating, and not simply as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. 4 key building blocks of prosperous societies are deteriorating: executive constraints, political accountability, freedom of assembly, and freedom of speech. At this pivotal moment in our history, these principles that build true prosperity are being challenged across the world. The emergence of China and India as superpowers, the retreating of the US from the role of global leadership, and the emergence of the UK as an independent nation, with the questions that raises for the unity of the EU, are all shifting geopolitical tectonic plates. As these shifts take place, we are faced with challenging questions. Can capitalism and an open economy easily coexist with authoritarianism? Do free markets automatically imply free speech? The answers to these questions can be found in the Prosperity Index. Yes, it's possible to limit the freedom of your people and build an open economy. And yes, it's possible to suppress free speech and build free markets. But it is not possible to do these things and build true prosperity. The suppression of the freedom of people and their speech will always lead to limited and stunted prosperity. Societies that restrict personal liberties ultimately erode trust and social capital. innovation and dynamism will become stifled, and the state will find itself having to expend ever greater resources to engender compliance. If we want to create lasting pathways to prosperity, we must not take our core freedoms for granted. More so than ever, it's imperative to recognise their irreplaceable role as the foundations of inclusive societies, open economies, and empowered people. It's only by preserving, protecting, nurturing, and celebrating the foundations of prosperity that we can continue the extraordinary progress we've seen over the past 30 years and grapple with the many challenges facing the world in the 2020s and beyond.
Can I just give a shout out to Juan Hernandez, who is our videographer and who's created these 3 films for us. He's sitting right at the very back. Juan, thank you. Our work at the Institute clearly shows that it is only by preserving, nurturing and celebrating the foundations of prosperity that we can continue the extraordinary progress that we have seen over the past 30 years. I know that this is a subject that our next guest has given a huge amount of thought to, so much so that he is willing to get up before the sun has even risen on his homeland in Australia. So joining us to discuss how we can mitigate the growing threats to our prosperity, I'm delighted to introduce a good friend and a great statesman, former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable John Anderson. John, welcome, and thank you so much for getting up so early in order to join us for this conversation.
Philippa, it's a great honour to be with you. I salute you as a friend personally, but as a friend to the things that we believe in, the flourishing of our fellow human beings in our own countries and around the world.
Thank you, John. And John, you've heard that last video that we have just been watching together. And since 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have seen that many nations have undergone the most extraordinary growth in their prosperity. What do you see as the key building blocks that underpin that prosperity?
Well, Philippa, I think it was a terrific little video. It just shows the quality of the work that you do at Legatum. That the collapse of the Berlin Wall, in a sense, threw into stark relief the difference between democratic capitalism and the prosperity that it delivered and the misery that the alternative in Eastern Germany and across Europe, in communist Europe, was providing for its citizens. And people wanted better. One system worked, one did not. And so, as Francis Fukuyama put it, we thought the end of history had arrived, a play really on Karl Marx, who thought the end of history would be some sort of nirvana based on a communist state. In reality, democracy won out and democracy became a winner. People wanted to embrace it. It spread widely with enormously and much more positive outcomes than people generally recognise. There was a peace dividend. People were able to divert their attention and their resources away from defence. That's all under threat again now because of the problem of the rising of authoritarianism again in very alarming ways. But what we saw was really quite spectacular, and many people have done far better as a result. I think I would come to 4 essential freedoms that you've touched on. Let's elaborate them briefly. Freedom, I would say, freedom of the thing that's most dear to us all if we stop and think about it. What do we really believe? What do our consciences demand us to do? If we're to be true to ourselves, we need freedom in that area to believe as we choose earnestly, having thought long and hard about it. Secondly, there is freedom of speech, perhaps the freedom by which we defend all others. We have then freedom of assembly. There's no real freedom if you can't meet with people that you agree with even discriminate against people without rejecting them or demeaning them with whom we have differences. But there's also the freedom to own property, to trade property, to purchase property. If I'm a humble farmer in a capitalist or free enterprise society, if I produce an extra dozen eggs, I know they're mine to use as chips to trade and build my prosperity. If I live in an authoritarian or a feudal arrangement where my overlord can remove it from me, why will I bother producing that extra dozen eggs so that I can prosper and somebody else can profit by being able to purchase them so they can get on with their comparative advantage? These things are incredibly interwoven, incredibly importantly interdependent. And when people are able to enjoy them, take them forward in confidence, they then in a democracy are able to create a government that reflects their will. Government becomes a function of the will of the people rather than the people having to subject themselves to being shaped by government. And I think that's where real freedom and personal prosperity and flourishing lies, or the basis of them lies.
John, it looks as though developed nations are taking some of what you have just been describing for granted. What do you see as some of the greatest threats for developed nations?
In a strange way, I think that one of the problems is that feelings now outweigh data. I mean, so much of what you put together with the Prosperity Index is hard information that provides a real pathway based in reality, not in feelings. And we need to reconnect. What do I mean by that? Well, if you take free speech, which we all proclaim is so important, we know that on American campuses, and this has spread right across the West, from around 2014, free speech became not the means by which, say, a minority defends their rights, but a mechanism seen as one which allows majorities to, if you like, attack and undermine and hurt and damage minorities. This is an extraordinary reversal in thinking. And I think it's a great shame and very dangerous indeed. So you've seen this sort of relentless attack on the credibility, if you like, or the cultural credibility of our institutions. Our freedoms in the West are not so much under threat at this point in time, in my view, from military coercion, dangerous as the times are, or the collapse of our institutions, but the collapse in the belief in our core values and the institutions that keep those core values properly functioning and effective. I think it's very concerning. We're almost entering an age of self-loathing.
And John, this stagnation that we have been talking about tonight has obviously happened during COVID-19. But you've reflected on these issues that you've just been sharing with us and your concerns. You know, as somebody who's been reflecting for a period of time on this, do you think they go much deeper than just this COVID-19 moment?
I do. I think we've been degrading the quality of public debate. And I think that one of the products of that is that in the sense with COVID, what we've seen is a tendency to focus on health, which is obviously important. But if you get good public outcomes, you've got to balance it with other aspects, such as the impact on people's liberties, the impact on people's mental health of massive lockdowns, and also the morality and the wisdom of purchasing our way out of the problem with borrowed money, in effect, our children's money. We have spent an incredible amount of money. We're now deeply in debt. I also think that the lack of quality debate has further exacerbated another problem that's been referred to very appropriately already this morning. This morning, Australian time, the breakdown of trust. And the breakdown of trust in government and between people in Western culture is very dangerous indeed. Whenever 2 or 3 people are gathered together, trust will become an issue. Do I trust these people that I'm with? If so, we can move together in cooperation. If we do not, then I start to look for security. Security becomes more important than freedom and cooperation. And I think there's been a serious breakdown of trust between nations, within nations, even within families, that COVID has exacerbated at the same time as it's left a terrible intergenerational problem of the buildup of debt. So I think it's accelerated trends that were already there. It's advanced history, and it is going to make it more challenging than ever to get people to focus on the very important things that you are drawing our attention to with the Prosperity Index.
John, thank you. And just lastly, before you actually go and have your breakfast this morning, you are one of the most optimistic people that I know. How do you think some of the divisions that you have just been describing, how do you see them being overcome in the future?
Well, it's a good question. I have moments these days when I'm not so optimistic. I really do worry about the polarisation that we're seeing in our communities, the tribalisation and the breaking down of trust and the emergence of identity politics, which is a default human position rather than of cooperation. But the biggest single thing that gives me cause for hope is that under challenge, people who think clearly, especially many young people, are now really stepping up and saying everything's at risk here. Not enough young people, let me throw that challenge out to be utterly realistic, but the cream are thinking more clearly and are really starting to gear up for leadership. And sometimes, you Brits are brilliant at this, the darkest hour is the one before the dawn, when people really get going, facing challenges. We see the very best of leadership. And that's what we need now, not demagogic leadership, not overbearing leadership, but leadership that is deeply committed to the well-being and the advancement of our fellow human beings.
John, can I just say thank you to you. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your friendship to us as well over the years and for sharing with us how to overcome some of these challenges. We are hugely grateful that you are with us tonight, or rather, should I say, this morning. Thank you so much.
It's a joy and a privilege.
It's wonderful that he was able to join us and also that the technology actually worked. I cannot tell you how relieved I am for that one. Thank you, team. The key lessons from this year's Prosperity Index are twofold. First, if you want to build the much desired outcome of the well-being of a nation's people, a nation's prosperity, there are no shortcuts. You have to invest in the foundational principles of nation building. However prosperous a nation you are, you have to invest in good governance. As we've heard, you have to invest in the rule of law, strong social capital, and personal freedom. And second, given the sheer scale of the challenge that nations face when they go on through that development arc, leaders can ill afford to become distracted by divisionist politics and fads. Effective political leadership must seek to bring people together, focusing on the many things that we have in common rather than the few things that we differ on. As we have highlighted tonight, we cannot be complacent. And with this in mind, I have great pleasure in introducing our final speaker to this audience. I'm delighted to invite on stage historian, author, and broadcaster Neil Oliver.
Good evening, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests. It's a pleasure, Alan said in his opening remarks, it's a pleasure just to be in a room full of living, breathing people. I think we're probably all agreed that amongst many other solutions to our problems, I think the simple togetherness of people, both like-minded and in enthusiastic, combative conversation with one another, I think that's the environment in which our solutions will be found. Ordinarily, when invited to speak, I indulge myself with freeballing and riffing on a few thoughts. Some might say making things up as I go along. But given the gravity, I think, of the situation in which we find ourselves, and also because time is relatively short, unusually for me, I've written something down. And if you'll bear with me, I would like to largely read to you from those thoughts rather than just extemporizing. Having said that, I'll start not with my own words, but the words of Humbert Wolf in Requiem for a Soldier. Down some cold field in a world outspoken, the young men are walking together, slim and tall. And though they laugh to one another, silence is not broken. There is no sound, however clear they call. They are speaking together of what they loved in vain here, but the air is too thin to carry the things they say. They were young and golden, but they came on pain here, and their youth is age now, their gold is grey. Yet their hearts are not changed, and they cry to one another. What have they done with the lives we laid aside? Are they young with our youth, gold with our gold, my brother? Do they smile in the face of death because we died? Down some cold field in a world uncharted, the young seek each other with questioning eyes. They question each other, the young, the golden-hearted, of the world that they were robbed of in their quiet paradise. Requiem for a Soldier. I think about those lives of young men over and over. What have they done with the lives we laid aside, they ask. Are they young with our youth, gold with our gold, my brother? Do they laugh in the face of death because we died? This is the time of remembrance. This is the time of year when we promise the dead, and perhaps more importantly, each other, that we will defend the peace and the freedoms for which our ancestors paid with their young lives. But those words, those promises we make are only hollow and empty, however, if we do no more than speak them. Defence of freedom must be lived out and enacted every moment of every day, ideally, and thereby made real and kept vivid with the flowing blood of the living. If we mouth the words about defending freedom and yet stand aside while those freedoms are eroded and erased, then we dishonour the dead and also each other. In the civilised West, we have known peace in the main since the end of the Second World War. There have been countless conflicts since, of course there have, and our fighting men and women have been in harm's way over and over again. But for most of us here in our homes, we have known unprecedented peace and freedom for more than 70 years. It's my belief that we have lived in peace and freedom for so long, longer than the biblical 70 years and 10, that we've lived that way for so long that too many of us have come to take those gifts utterly for granted. So taken for granted are our freedoms now. We've allowed ourselves to believe that the way we have lived here for a few decades is somehow natural, that freedom such as we have known is in the natural order of things. But of course, even the most cursory look at history reveals that our way of life here has been the most unnatural of any yet seen on planet Earth. Our way of peace and freedom has been nothing less than bizarre by comparison to everything else that has gone before. We live inside a miraculous soap bubble of the utmost fragility. Or you might say that rather we exist in a penthouse flat at the top of a great tower. We've been afforded the best views in the history of humankind, but only because we are held aloft by that tower, made of centuries and millennia of suffering and sacrifice. And in so many ways now, we seem to be kicking at the masonry and the planks that are holding us up. And if we do away with that tower, where will we be? We will not remain aloft. Every significant civilization before ours, every kingdom and empire was a dictatorship built on the slavery and exploitation of the masses by a tiny elite that persuaded or frightened everyone in its thrall into accepting that only a tiny handful of special people deserved an elegant and elevated life. Babylon, Egypt, Greece, Persia, Rome, Ottoman, every one of them built on and by slaves whose lives were deemed to matter not at all. That is the natural order of things. That is how things were for most people almost all of the time. It is awareness of that fact, constant awareness, that should make us see how blessedly unnatural our way of life has been for what amounts to just a few ridiculously lucky generations in the scheme of things. For a couple of centuries, and on account of a sequence of events nothing short of miraculous, something different has flowered here. The end of slavery, votes for the masses, education for all, rule of law, equality of men and women, tolerance of religions, tolerance of sexuality. It has not been perfect. Some would say it has been a long way from perfect. But when I hear what we have had run down and damned with endless criticism, what I want to shout is, compared to where? And compared to what? I have long been fascinated by Francis Hutcheson, who had the chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow University during the time known as the Scottish Enlightenment. He taught that by acting morally and demanding the happiness of others, a person might make him or herself a happiness of the most lasting and meaningful kind. Happiness was not a random gift from God, but rather the product of acting morally towards others. One of his students was John Witherspoon, second president of Princeton and a signatory of the Declaration of Independence. And there are good reasons for thinking that the concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness come from the thinking of Francis Hutcheson. But there you have it. Happiness is a collateral benefit of being moral, of living morally. What has been done these past months has not, I say, been moral. People's lives have been stopped, children's educations set aside, livelihoods destroyed, people's physical and mental health compromised in many ways beyond repair, people left isolated, society atomized. This has been immoral. The price paid in hopes of controlling a virus and more recently halting climate change has been too high. All around the world, in Canada and North America, throughout Europe, in Australia and New Zealand, in Israel, in South Africa, governments are quite simply stamping on the rights of their populations. Rubber bullets and pepper spray, overmighty police forces, the deployment of psychological tricks and tactics and nudge units, fear and propaganda. In Austria, they're segregating the population, dividing the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, identifying the clean and the unclean, the good and the bad, the return of the Untermensch. This is immoral. Just because a government makes something law does not necessarily make it moral, far less good. History is littered with the damage caused when governments passed immoral laws for whatever reason. In every one of those countries, ours included, any power invested in government is a loan from the people. None of those populations voted to be ruled by its government. Rulership is the obsession of kings, emperors, and other despots. Democratic governments exist or should exist to defend freedom, to enable people to go about their lives and to make the best of them. With every day that passes, it becomes harder to avoid the conclusion that our Western civilization is being dismantled piece by piece by those that would see it gone forever and replaced with something else. That remains to be seen what that something else might be, or what we, the proletariat, will be allowed to do there. We've also been provoked about pronouns and gender. We've been told to see ourselves first and foremost as skin colours and religions. We've been told to focus on our immutable differences. We've been told to feel shame about our history and culture. We've been told to forget about owning cars and taking advantage of international travel. We must contemplate smaller, colder lives. We are told this by people who say one thing and do another. Whatever new life awaits the mass of us, those sending us on our way are clearly intending to carry on as they have always done. The hypocrisy of our leaders and elites must surely stick in our throats. Always we must ask ourselves, who benefits from all of this? During the pandemic, billionaires have seen the greatest ever increase in their personal wealth. For the elite, it has been a good war. Advantage has been taken of a situation. The situation has been the virus and more recently the promise of an apocalypse made of climate change. Millions of people have been frightened and deliberately into a submissive state of mind. Freedom has been traded for an illusion of security. What I feel around me more than fear, angst, anxiety, and uncertainty is loss of confidence. I think that loss of confidence has been coming for a while, and that these past months have only highlighted and accelerated the process. Kenneth Clark, the art historian, not the politician, has written and broadcast in decades past very persuasively about civilization and the necessary building blocks thereof. And he expresses how more than anything else, meaningful civilization requires confidence. Confidence in the society in which we live, belief in its philosophy, belief in its laws, and confidence in our own mental powers as functioning individuals. All the great civilizations have had a weight of positive energy behind them. People think civilization is about fine buildings, the arts and culture, education for all, equality before the law, fine sensibilities and good conversation. These are among the results of civilization, but they are not what make a civilization. A society can have all of these niceties and yet still fail. Civilizations like Rome and Greece collapsed on account of exhaustion. In his poem, Waiting for the Barbarians, modern Greek poet C.P. Cavafy described the inhabitants of a grand city waiting behind their walls for the arrival of barbarians known to be massing nearby. Such is the hopeless state of mind of the city dwellers. They're actually looking forward to the invasion just because it promises change from all that now bores them, all that they have taken for granted. Then news arrives that the barbarians have moved on. Now what's going to happen to us without barbarians, they ask. Those people were a kind of solution. I started with the words of Humbert Wolff, a British-Italian man of letters. In his work, Uncelestial City, he wrote, "You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist, but seeing what that man will do unbribed, there's no occasion to." Our mainstream media, bribed or not, has been greatly to blame for what has unfolded here these months past. There's been a narrative made dominant and all but irresistible by the enthusiasm of the majority of the media for cheerleading the manipulation of the majority of the people into a frightened, angst-ridden, compliant state. This is lamentable, but not new and not surprising either for anyone who has paid attention to history. Now, enough already with the doom and gloom. I'm among the first to admit that I have what might accurately be described as miserable bastard tendencies. As they do say, it's never hard to discern the difference between a Scotsman and a ray of sunshine. If anyone were to describe me thus, it would not be for the first time. Fortunately, I am aware of my own tendencies and I do seek to find the antidote for myself. I believe that hope is not just a good thing, but also irresistible. Hope is as perennial as the grass and as determined. It cannot be kept down, not even by marching boots and concrete. It can be tempting to think that entities may grow too big to fail. At the moment, we're in the grip of an unholy alliance between big state, big business, and technocrats. So much seems to be going their way. But history shows that entities inevitably grow so big that they can only fail. The energy required to keep millions or billions of people under control and going against their better, hopeful natures is ruinous. Such an effort is doomed to exhaustion by its sheer scale. It's simply too much hard work. Bad ideas fail, always. Good ideas cannot be kept down. The return to better days will be led by those who have paid attention to history and so know that hope, like the grass, needs only the light of day. As it says in the Talmud, Every blade of grass has its angel that bends over it, whispering, grow, grow. I believe that what we have watched since the spring of last year or thereabouts is an exercise in hubris, which is to say overconfidence on the part of those who sought to take advantage of a situation so as to seek ends that might otherwise have remained out of reach. But too many people have been made unhappy, and that situation will not sustain. History also shows us that it does not take the majority of a population or anything like it to make the difference that matters. Rather, history shows that it only takes a handful of hopeful people to let in the light. Price's law, as I understand it, says that the square root of the number of people in any organisation does 50% of the work, which is to say that if you have 10,000 people in your organisation, 50% of the work is down to just 100 of those people. That might be hard to believe, but it's proven in every case. It's not unlike the Pareto principle that does everything right down to and including predicting the propagation of a gas in a vacuum. Perhaps above all else, what is needed is just for some few of us to acknowledge that we here in this part of the world have been the luckiest in the story of creation so far. What we have had, this fragile soap bubble, this tower built of the sacrifice and endeavour of others, is the greatest gift any generation has ever been granted. Ensuring that gift might be handed on to our children demands that we first recognise and then commit ourselves to maintaining that which we have had. Thanks very much.
I will now make way for Philippa for some remarks.
Well, if you thought you were going to be short of conversation over your canapes and wine afterwards, you are no longer short of conversation over your canapes and wine. Neil, thank you so much for that and for reminding us how fortunate we are and also how much there is at stake and that could be lost. Thank you. And thank you once again to all of our distinguished speakers and to all of you here in London and to all of you who are also online for joining us this evening for this special event. It is hard to overstate the importance of the moment that we currently stand in, although Neil, I think, did a very good job of stating the importance of this moment. It is no exaggeration to describe it as an inflection point. Neil described it with poetry. We describe it with data. But the reality is the data tells us we are standing at an inflection point. Global prosperity is stagnating, and if we are not careful, we risk seeing it going into decline, jeopardizing so many of the hard-won gains of recent decades. But we can and we must act. Just as improving prosperity is not inevitable, neither is its deterioration. This year's index should be a call to action to safeguard the invaluable foundations of prosperity, to nurture them and to build on them for future generations. This is the challenge of our generation, to work together to strengthen governance and to secure our essential freedoms. As tonight has made clear, these things are not just desirable, they're absolutely fundamental. They are the foundations and the building blocks of prosperity. Our world is crying out for change, and all of us have a part to play in that change. So when you go to bed at night, if you're somebody who thinks in the evening, or when you get up in the morning, if you're somebody who thinks in the morning, I call on you and ask you to make a commitment to yourself, to make your unique contribution to strengthening your family, your community, and your nation. For policymakers, and for those of you who are policymakers who are here, This will mean focusing on what genuinely moves the dial, not just what grabs a headline. For business leaders, this means thinking about your purpose as well as your profit. For the media, this means reporting on what is true and important and not just salacious. For civil society leaders, it means acting as agents of unity and not fueling division. Let us be really clear. Prosperity will not simply appear in a political manifesto or a government press release, or from a philanthropic donation or newspaper headline. It will come from each and every one of us. That means summoning from us the qualities of those we most admire, grit and determination, as we've seen in President Masisi, integrity and vision, as we heard from John Howard. We all have it within us to be change makers, bridge builders, and unifiers. So let's work together to build prosperity and build that pathway from poverty to prosperity, which means a life well lived. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.